my name is William Smith Johannes, and my student ID is 2025137293. So today I will be presenting about chapter 1.3, pollination and fertilization process and life cycle. So in this chapter, we will explore how pollination happens in plants, how it leads to fertilization, and the complete life cycle of a flowering plant. So this process is very important in agriculture and plant production because it helps plant reproduce and produce fruit and seeds. So let's start with pollination. So first of all, what is pollination? So pollination is when pollen grains move from one part of a flower to another so the plant can start making seeds. So the pollen comes from the anther, which is the male part of the flower, and it contains the male cells needed to create new plants. So for fertilization to happen, the pollen must land on the stigma, which is the female part of the flower. So this is the first step in sexual reproduction for flowering plants. So pollination can happen in different ways. Self-pollination is when the pollen goes to the stigma in the same flower or to another flower on the same plant. Cross-pollination is when pollen travels to a flower on a different plant of the same type. So in simple terms, pollination is like moving the male part to the female part so the plant can make seeds and grow new plants. Okay, so next is about the pollinators. So pollinators are animals or things that help move pollen from one flower to another so plants can make seeds. Most pollinators are insects like bees, moths, butterflies, and beetles. Some animals with backbones such as bats and birds also help. Even wind and water can carry pollen between flowers. Flowers attract pollinators in different ways. They have bright colors to get the attention of insects, and white flowers are easier for night pollinators like moths to see. So many flowers have a sweet smell that draws in insects. They also offer nectar and pollen as food. So some petals have special markings to guide insects to the center of the flower. So when insects land on the flower, the pollen sticks to their bodies and gets carried to the next flower they visit. Okay, so next about the pollen grain development, which is microsporogenesis. So pollen grain development, also called microsporogenesis, happens inside the anther of a flower. So inside the anther, there are pollen sacs filled with special cells called microsporocytes. These microsporocytes go through a process called meiosis, where each one divides to make 4 new cells called microspores. After meiosis, each microspore goes through mitosis, which is another kind of cell division. This creates a pollen grain that has 2 cells inside it, which is the tube cell and the generative cell. The tube cell will later grow into a pollen tube, and the generative cell will divide again to form 2 sperm cells. So when the pollen grain lands on the stigma of a flower, it starts to grow a tube down into the ovule so that the sperm cells can travel and fertilize the egg. So this is how pollen grains develop and get ready to take part in the fertilization process in flowering plants. So next is about the female genotype development, also known as megasporogenesis. So this female genotype development happens inside the ovule of a flower. So inside the ovule, there is a megaspore mother cell that divides by meiosis to make 4 megaspores. So usually, only 1 megaspore stay alive and the other 3 break down. The surviving megaspore divides by mitosis to form the embryo sac, which is the female gametophyte. The embryo sac has the egg cell that will join with a sperm cell during fertilization. So this process is important because it forms the part that will become a seed after fertilization. So next is about the double fertilization. Double fertilization happens in flowering plants. In the pollen grain, there are 2 cells, which is one cell grows into a pollen tube that goes into the ovary. The other cells divide into 2 sperm cells. One sperm cell joins with the egg cell to make a zygote, which will grow into the baby plant. The second sperm joins with two other nuclei to form the endosperm, which will be food for the seed. So the ovule has two layers around it called integuments. After fertilization, these layers turns into the hard seed coat. So the wall of the ovary becomes thicker and change into the pericarp, which is the outer part of the fruit.
Usual reproductive process in which there are two fertilization events rather than just one. This double fertilization takes place between cells produced in the male reproductive organs, the anthers, and the female reproductive organ, the ovule. The ovule contains a reproductive cell called the megaspore mother cell or megasporocyte. This cell is diploid and undergoes meiosis to produce 4 haploid megaspores. In most species, 3 degenerate, leaving 1 surviving megaspore. The 1 surviving megaspore then undergoes 3 rounds of mitosis to produce 8 haploid nuclei. Cytoplasmic divisions do not immediately follow the nuclear divisions, so the 8 nuclei initially share the same cytoplasm. This multinucleate structure is called the embryo sac. Within the embryo sac, cell walls form between most of the nuclei. 3 cells called antipodal cells form opposite the micropyle opening of the ovule. 3 also form near the micropyle. 2 are called synergids, and the other is the egg. Finally, 2 nuclei called polar nuclei remain together in one large central cell. The egg cell and the single cell with 2 polar nuclei will eventually take part in a double fertilization event. Before this can happen, the male gametes, the sperm, must travel to these cells within the female's reproductive organs. To reach the embryo sac, a pollen grain that has landed on the stigma begins to germinate, sending a long pollen tube through the style and ovary. A haploid cell, called a generative cell, travels down the pollen tube. The generative cell travels behind the tube nucleus, which is the nucleus of the large cell that makes up the bulk of the pollen tube and grain. The generative cell divides by mitosis to produce 2 haploid sperm cells. The pollen tube reaches the micropyle of the ovule and digests its way into one of the synergids, releasing the sperm cells. The synergid degenerates as one of the 2 sperm cells fertilizes the egg cell, producing a diploid zygote. The second sperm cell fuses with both of the polar nuclei, fertilizing them to produce an unusual triploid cell. As the zygote develops into an embryo, the triploid cell develops into the endosperm, which serves as the embryo's food supply.
Last but not least is about the plant life cycle. So the plant life cycle starts when a seed germinates and grows roots and a small shoot. So the young plant, called a seedlings, develops leaves to make food through photosynthesis. So when it matures, it forms flowers where pollination and fertilization happen. So these seeds develop inside the fruit, and then when the fruit is ripe, it releases the seeds to start the cycle again. So in terms of alternation of generation, plants switch between 2 stages. First, the sporophyte is the main plant we see that makes spores by meiosis. The spores grow into the gametophyte, which produce sperm and egg cells. So when these gametes join, they form a zygote that grows back into a sporophyte and repeating the life cycle of the plant again. So that's all from me. Thank you very much and goodbye.